making our speakers feel like they belong in a futuristic call center. This session is called The Writer and the State, and here we have with us Ariel Dorfman, Dikotter, Buruma, Selma Dabbagh, Sudeep Chakravarti, and Timothy Garton who lead the conversation. This really asks, what the duties of the writer are to the state, and what happens when a writer is faced with oppression, and what happens at that point where the writer comes into opposition with the state. And that's what we'll be exploring. Timothy Garton has charted the transformation of Europe over the last 30 years in a series of political writings, 9 books in fact. He's the professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Foundation at Stanford. And his most recent books are Facts Are Subversive, Political Writing from a Decade Without a Name. He's interestingly leading a major project right now set up by Oxford University on global freedom of expression in the internet age. So over to you, Timothy, and thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Anyone in the audience who knows my usual voice will realize that I left my voice at Mumbai airport yesterday evening. So it may pack up in the course of this hour, in which case I will be like a failed state, and these writers will be able to do whatever they like. But while it holds up, we have the most fantastic panel, all of them with extraordinary literary writing biographies. You have the biographies in the program, and with amazing self-sacrifice and nobility, they've all agreed to the rule I proposed, which was not to have a series of long statements at the beginning, which would take up most of the session, and not to say the obvious things like the writer should bear witness, the writer should expose the evil deeds of the state, we should speak truth to power, we all know that, but should say just one or two clear, original, provocative things in 3 to maximum 4 minutes. When they get to 3 minutes, they'll get the white card, since I don't have the yellow card, which is universal in football. When they get to 4 minutes, they'll get the pink card, since this is India rather than the red one. But of course, they'll all be, as I say, fantastically disciplined as well as brilliant. And we're going to go in the order which rather delightfully we have on the website, which is the order of first names, which quite appropriately gives pride of place to our first speaker, Ariel Dorfman. Now, Ariel, of course, you have extraordinary experience of writing about an extremely oppressive state, and indeed the transition from a liberating state to an oppressive state in Pinochet's Chile, both from inside and from outside. What are your few thoughts?
Well, the first thing is we have to realize that the states vary enormously, and the relationship of the writer varies according to his or her relationship with that, right? So I have had either the privilege, the curse, or the blessing of having been through 4 absolutely different situations. One where a revolution, where we had with Allende, who was our president, and where we had to decide how we were able to help a revolution take power and have people have more power. And the relationship is an ambiguous one, because you feel much better being against the state than being with the state, The second was when that state was overthrown by General Pinochet, and then we had 17 years of dictatorship, of torture, of exile, and oppression. And as I've always said, that's always very, very hard on the body, but it's pretty good on the soul, because you feel very good about that. But even in that case, do you criticize your own people as you try to overthrow somebody much worse than anything that your own people can do? Then you go to a third state, which is that of transition to democracy, which is the most complex of all. Because that's when they've been telling you, now you can go back to writing about roses and rose water. But should you? And then the question is, do you criticize those who carried out the revolution against these oppressors? And then it's very similar to what's happening for the Arab Spring today. So I feel very, very common ground with them. And the fourth one is what happens when you're simply in a democracy that has, of course, all sorts of rules. It is a state, it's a democratic state, and yet the state as such is always has an axe to grind with the writer. So there's always some truth that is going to be incredibly disturbing. And I personally love transgressive literature. I love ambiguous literature because it makes people think and makes people ask. And I don't think I've even reached my first white card, but I will stay there and simply say that there are different situations. And it depends also on how and what you want to do. Because I can remember, for instance, saying to myself, one of the reasons why I want to get rid of this dictator is so that I don't have to write about the dictator. And so they kept on asking me, what will you do, Ariel, when Pinochet is gone? As if it would be that easy, you know. And I wrote to John Berger, a dear friend of mine, and he said, you must write as if Pinochet had already been defeated. Which allowed me then, when the transition came, to write Death and the Maiden, because I'd already prepared myself in some sense. So it's a very complex situation. I hope I can return to some of these when I come back later. But I just wanted to emphasize how complex it all is. And there's not a formula. I don't like, we hate abstraction. Writers hate abstraction. So we must be very concrete about the situations we've been in and how we reacted to those situations.
Thank you very much for an absolutely brilliantly concise and exemplary exposition of some of the problems, and we'll come back to several of those points, including the curious but very ambiguous moral comfort of simply being able to be against black and white. Now, Frank Dikotter, you're in the interesting position of being a remarkable historian from outside who exposed one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century in China in extraordinary and irrefutable detail. Would you like to add your thoughts?
I would love to. Of course, I'm not really in a position to say what writers should do against an oppressive state, simply because
Can you hear?
that's not
Can you hear? Microphone.
Microphone is right here somehow. I feel a bit like a horse with this contraction around my head. I hope you can hear me now.
Is that better? Is that better?
As a historian, I study those who say what people should do. So I wouldn't want to be the one who says what writers should be doing against an oppressive state. But there is another point, namely that I myself am not exactly a hero. It's true. I do spend time in archives, and occasionally I feel the threat of being somehow banned from China for writing the stuff I do.
Tim, there's somebody's really
But
very loud.
I really am a coward. I work on the People's Republic of China, but I live in Hong Kong. I'm not a permanent resident of Hong Kong. I'm a Dutch passport holder. I can go back to Europe at any one time. So I'm a coward, and I like it that way. So I'm not going to pontificate about what others should do. But my true source of inspiration are some of my colleagues in the People's Republic of China and who can't leave. Historians who take extraordinary risks to do the work they do to break the silence about the horrors that happened after 1949. Here's one example. A friend of mine, Xu Zerong, who was arrested and put in jail for working on the Korean War, which happened more than 60 years ago. He came out of jail last year after 10 years. And guess what he's doing now? Oh, he's in the People's Republic of China. He's still working on the Korean War. He came to visit me 3 weeks ago. Or Yu Xiguang, who was put in jail for revealing documents about the Cultural Revolution, went to jail too. Is still going around the country amassing archives at county level about Mao's Great Famine, which claimed tens of millions of people. Completely dedicated. Dogged determination to pursue the truth. These, in my view, are the real true heroes. Now, of course, there are other colleagues, friends, historians in the People's Republic who don't always go that far, and I can very well understand how they have to compromise in order to keep some of their freedom to write, which is not to say that they don't meet up with representatives of the Public Security Bureau very regularly. Most of my colleagues do. They get regular visits. Their phones are probably tapped. Their emails is hacked into. But they try to compromise. I can even somehow vaguely understand why some of them would want to become, say, vice chairman of the China Writers Association, that essential cog in the machinery of repression. So while I don't have anything to say about what people should do, I do have a plea for some of my friends across the border from Hong Kong. If you do win a Nobel Prize one day, and you are on your way to Stockholm to pick up the prize, and you wish to discuss the censorship that continues to crush the lives of so many writers, please don't compare it to airport security, because it makes me and others feel physically quite sick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In case anyone didn't get that, we're talking about the winner of last year's Nobel Prize for Literature. Frank, that also raises a very interesting question of the writer from outside writing about another state and confronting another state with its difficult history. Now, Ian Buruma, you've lived in more states and written about more states than most people have had hot dinners. You're on the way of the ultimate insider-outsider. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, panel discussions are very boring if people agree. So I'll start picking a quarrel and defend Moyenne. I don't think writers of fiction or poets have any duty at all. I don't think they need to be dissidents. I think they need to be judged on their fiction and their poetry, their art. Because of that, I think it's been unfortunate, for example, that some Eastern European writers in particular were very popular in other countries when communism was still there, and people completely lost interest in them after 1989. So I don't think they have duties. In fact, I think one of the great things about living in an open society is that you're liberated from being political. And one of the terrible things about a totalitarian society, that it's not enough not to be critical of your rulers. You have to be actively praising them all the time. So the right to be apolitical, I think, is an important one. And certainly Moyenne, the Nobel Prize winner, is no dissident, was not courageous, even abject. I would agree in that, in his comments, rather flip comments on censorship. But I don't think his literature should be judged by whether he's a dissident or not, or his attitude to the Chinese state. The problem with what I've just said is, of course, that Moyenne's apolitical attitude is exactly what the current Chinese government would want. It is an authoritarian state, it's not a totalitarian state, and it can be compared perhaps a little bit to Germany in the late 19th century, where the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the writers, the intellectuals and so on were encouraged to withdraw from politics, from political debate, and get on with poetry, fiction and so on. So there was room for great literature, but there was no room for real political dissent. And Thomas Mann famously wrote a book basically praising this idea of that the true intellectual, the writer, should be above political strife and should withdraw from politics. And this is exactly what the current state of China would want its writers to do. So there is a problem, of course, I would agree there, with Moyenne's attitude, but there is also room, just enough room, for great literature, for great art to be created in a state like that too. And I think writers, artists should have the perfect right to do so. Now, I say fiction and poetry. I think the situation is slightly different if you're an historian or a public intellectual or a political commentator. I mean, then clearly the kind of attitude taken by a writer such as Moyenne would be a mistake and a dereliction of duty. But I would conclude by saying something rather banal, but that the true state of freedom is to be able to choose exactly the degree to which you wish to be political. And that can also mean the decision not to be at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think most of us will remember Orban's great lines, which Joseph Brodsky loved to quote: "Time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent worships language and forgives. everyone by whom it lives. However appalling your conduct was in your own time, if the poetry you left behind was great, time will forgive you because your language has lived through it. And two good examples of that are Bertolt Brecht, a horrible, monstrous man, but a great poet, alas. And if I dare say so here, Rudyard Kipling. Kipling, in many ways a frightful chauvinist and imperialist, but actually a great poet, and therefore his poetry, I think, lives. Someone may want to dispute that from the audience. Now, moving on to Selma Dabbagh. You're in an interesting position because you're a British Palestinian writer, writing in some sense from about for, choose your own word, a state that does not yet fully exist. So in a sense you're in Ariel Dorfman's first phase. And I imagine that poses for you the question that Ariel posed, namely, do you criticize your own side, or do you feel under moral pressure always, as it were, to stick with the party line?
Thank you. Well, I think there are several things here that I agree with, which have been said. And for me personally, I have this mixture in my background in terms of being very emotionally connected and personally connected to a Palestinian cause, which is my father's experience in terms of being expelled from Palestine in 1948. But I also have this luxurious position, perhaps as the coward, as Frank Dikotter referred to it, of being outside, of having a foreign passport, of not having to live through the occupation. But with the Palestinian situation, it's particularly unusual and it's particularly dire because you have got a population who have been spread across many different countries, who are, a lot of them, a lot of refugees still in camps. You've got a very divided population which is living under intense occupation, and the feeling for somebody in a position of my sort of luxury of having the English language at my disposal and education is that you should be appealing outwards, you should be communicating, because the sense is that you don't have the military or the political might, but what you have is the legal cause, the moral cause, and this should be explained somehow. That if this narrative was explained fully to the outside world, possibly America or the West, who are controlling Israel, that things would change. There's this sort of belief, it's almost a neurosis, that if every single part of the story were pieced together, things would suddenly adjust. And so people feel very possessive about the narrative. So it's very difficult for a fiction writer trying to explore with the freedom that Frank, that Ian Buruma was talking about, with absolute freedom to create art and to create something beautiful. When you're in these dire situations, there's a feeling that one should have this great political message. And the Palestinian writers who are really held up as being sort of icons are the ones who've been not just writers like Kanafani, but have sacrificed their lives. Some of them have been assassinated and have been strongly connected to a political party. So that's the sort of the expectation. So it was a real struggle for me when writing about this to find a place where you could explore these issues and to not feel irresponsible that in some way you were adding to the misunderstanding that was already there about the people that you're trying to represent.
And do you feel the obligation to criticize your own side?
But in terms of an obligation to criticize one's own side, at the time I was writing, there was a lot of infighting between Hamas and Fatah in Gaza, and it just felt that it felt very difficult to go there, but I had to go there. I felt that it was as important that you have an internal criticism going on, which is appealing to your own people, which is writing about the sort of the potential loss of humanity that the situation could be bringing, as it was to write to the outside. So it had to happen. I think there's a level of discomfort with it, but I think if you have to be aware that you are going through a process of revolution which can lead to not just a reenactment of the type of oppression that you've been under.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that theme, but finally I did want to bring in our Indian author, Sudeep Chakravarti, who of course has written a very brave and remarkable book about the Naxalite Maoist insurgency, which some in the Indian state presumably would not view very kindly. Would you like to give us your couple of comments?
Thank you. Of course, it's wonderful that we're here having a free-flowing discussion, freedom of speech and expression and all of that. But I do know that when I go to Eastern India next week to research my new book, which is a sort of a conflation of business and human rights, or the lack of it, I have a little checklist that I have for the last several years. I am a writer of fiction and non-fiction, and my non-fiction focuses on conflict issues. So I have a checklist that I tick off. Will in place, taxes paid, phone tapped, email account hacked, and I assume the same thing for the people that I'm probably going to be interviewing out there. In a place that I call Outland. We are all in inland, and Outland is a place in India or in the subcontinent which is sort of out of sight, out of a sort of a easily digestible mental construct, where bad things happen, things we don't want happening to this brave new world of India, future India happen, so on and so forth. And I simply have grown to assume such things where grand laws and freedom to speak, as I do right now, clashes violently, very often, with the way the state perceives freedom of expression and speech. And it comes, I think, from a way where the state has sort of taken upon itself. There's a lovely phrase in the subcontinent. It's derived from Hindi. It's "mai baap." It's literally mother-father. The state sort of assumes upon itself the role of mai baap, the benevolent dictator, even in a democracy as vibrant as ours. And as a writer, I constantly come up against that. So call me paranoid, call me what you will, but we've learned over time to be careful of the state, and yet come to a situation where you try and sort of create an output in words and opinion, where you're not necessarily jailed, acts of parliament and sort of from the Indian Penal Code, which describe you as waging war against the state, or pin upon you the law for sedition, which is a very quaint term in 2013, but as we speak, there are several 100,000 people who have cases of sedition against them, so on and so forth. And it's not always a state that a writer must contend with. I'm going to be I'm going to be a namak haram here, which is another lovely phrase where, I mean, it's sort of you go against the salt,
right,
so to speak, literally. The lovely tent is sponsored by a fine corporation. And here I want to talk about the fact where corporations, businesses have become in our country extensions really of the state, where, for instance, for acquiring land for this fine corporation in the state of Orissa in 2006 and subsequently, people were shot dead by the state police. And I think that's an extension where we're living in dangerous times, and we're not only dealing with how we perceive the state or how the state perceives writers and opinion makers or people who would get up and talk. And there are many, I mean, I'm not singular. I mean, there are many, many thousands of us who are trying to get the story out there, trying to tell stories that need all the telling, with the view of resolution of conflict, not to create conflict. I think that's important to understand. But I really fear for this sort of colliding universe that India currently exists in, where lines are being blurred, where state and business and opinion are blurred. We don't know really where we stand any longer. It's all very confusing, and therefore very, very dangerous. And I think we need all the freedom of speech and expression that we can possibly have.
Thank you very much indeed. I didn't hear the phrase quite acoustically. Was it against the salt or against the sod?
Salt.
Against the salt.
Namak is salt,
right.
and namak
against the
is a
salt.
tribute to the salt. It comes from an expression of the food that you eat.
Right.
Someone who feeds
you. I think we might say against the grain, possibly. I'm not sure we would think of the British state as mother-father. Probably some nagging mother-in-law would be more like it, if you go on to BBC. But anyway, that's an extremely fitting ending, because I want to pick up 3 points which have come out from these very different perspectives. The first is this: would anyone on the panel disagree with what I call the Orwell proposition? The Orwell proposition is this. George Orwell went to fight against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, and he came back and wrote one of his greatest books, Homage to Catalonia, which is famous for its criticism of his own side, in particular the communists. And Orwell, from that moment on, always said, if you're going to be honest as a political writer, you have always to be most critical of your own side. Not just critical of your own side, most critical of your own side, because you think it's the right side. Would anyone like to comment or disagree with that proposition? Ariel?
Yes, I mean, I think he's totally right, except that it takes a while to get there. And let me just give you an example, all right? You know, when my wife Angelica and I left Chile after the coup, we were really poor. We had no visa, the police were after us. In fact, we managed to get out of Argentina, and the secret police came for me 3 days later to my grandmother's house to kill me. And we had already left, fortunately. In those circumstances, I was offered by Jacobo Timmerman, who then became famous with his several books, who was the editor of La Opinión in Buenos Aires, to write 4 articles with $1,000 each for that. That kept us for 3 years, you know. We really had no money at all. We had just 2 suitcases and our little boy. And he offered if I would please tell the world what had happened in the Argentine embassy, where 1,000 people were stuck in a tiny, tiny space in order to sought refuge after the coup. And I told him I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because to wash that dirty linen, to show how the Salvadorians fought with the Nicaraguans inside the embassy, I mean, all of Latin America was there. To do that, I thought would have been irresponsible. He answered me and he said, I respect what you're saying, but the writer must always, always say what they think, always.
And do you think he was right?
He was right. But at that moment, when they were killing my friends and torturing our people in Chile, and when the lie that was being told about us through the media, they had this total power to say what they wanted. What you said was, you can't give them ammunition, further ammunition against us, because they'll be using it against you.
Right.
So it's a very complicated situation. I just wanted to complicate that of Orwell's, because he came from outside. If he had been Spanish, perhaps he would have been more careful about that, and we would have missed that wonderful book. Many years later, when I came to Chile, back to Chile in the transition to democracy, they said, we don't want to hear about torture. We don't want to hear about these things. And I said, you know what? Nobody's writing about these things. I have to write about them. Yeah. And I remember Timmerman, I said, I will write whatever I feel is necessary, even if I said, if the ship of state is going to sink because of it, then it should sink and we'll carry it again, you know. But without the truth, there will be no freedom. But it takes a while. It takes a while. It's not easy.
I think there's an interesting, and it's fascinating what you say, I think there's an interesting and really fine and difficult line between solidarity with the oppressed and self-censorship, which can follow.
It's very complicated. And it changes. You don't know where the line is.
Yeah.
The line changes for each person. It isn't if there's a formula. We have to be very careful not to be formulaic, say, you have to do this or you should do that. You know, each person will know what they need to do in those circumstances, and it changes at the same time. There isn't a formula for that.
Yeah,
I think I think it was Sartre who said, when people said, why didn't you write about the Gulag in the Soviet Union? He said, I don't want to concede a point to the other side. Right. And that's a very dangerous formula, and I can think of another example of somebody who was not at all famous, but is Italian, Frank Dikotter's area. When I was a student of Chinese in 1972, a fellow student of mine visited China. And you can only visit China in those days in a sort of group of friends, of so-called friends of China. And he was, like most students at the time, on the left, sympathetic to Maoism and so on. And he came back and he said he'd seen a sign somewhere in China which said, of graffiti, which said, "We are hungry." And he said, I would never publish that because I don't want to concede it to the other side.
Exactly.
Which is a terrible way and irresponsible.
I think there are 2 elements there. There's that, not giving comfort to the enemy. There's also what, as journalists, we used to call the visa syndrome. You're so nervous about the visa syndrome. You're so nervous about your next visa to visit, whatever oppressive regime it may be. Would anyone else like to jump in on that?
Well, the visa syndrome is as an outsider, I find myself in a very awkward position to tell my colleagues in the People's Republic what they should or shouldn't do. But of course, I do have friends in sinological circles in Europe and the United States who are on this, this very moral dilemma of conceding a point to the enemy. Quite clearly, their ideological conviction is with the one-party state. And it always amazes me how many of my colleagues were Maoist under Mao, Dengist under Deng, and God knows what it is under the latest leader. They all look alike, they all have the same haircut, they all dye their hair black. But there seems to be an extraordinary desire there to be on the right side in the People's Republic and to not talk about anything that might disturb that public image. So my real fight is actually not with colleagues in the People's Republic, but with sinologists.
Perhaps we should do an anthology of fellow travellers of all countries. Let me quickly, we've got a few minutes before we let people speak, but very quickly, two other propositions. One is what I'm now going to call the Buruma proposition, which is actually the creative writer, and I think we're talking about the creative writer here, not the non-fiction writer, should have the freedom not to write even about the terror and horrors that are happening around him. The counter-argument for that comes in the famous lines from Bertolt Brecht, that there are times when just to write about trees is itself a crime, because all these horrors are going on around you. Would anyone else like to jump in on the Buruma proposition?
Well, I like to stick my neck out all the time, so I indulge me, please. The Buruma proposition, I mean, I think if you're writing what you perceive and what you write with the motive force of what drives you and what consumes you in that sense, whether you're writing where you're a creative person or just a bludgeon of a writer or sensitive or writing fiction or non-fiction, I think the basic rule applies. I'm not a famous writer. I write both fiction and non-fiction, and I think that I'm sort of, yes, we pick and choose. We choose in a way to see something around us. We choose to postpone commenting on a situation, perhaps, so on and so forth. And perhaps I think all writers are all communicators in our own way. Communicators. In our own, I think we select subjects that we are comfortable talking about, right, that we empathize with very clearly, because then we can communicate all the better, whether we're writing creative fiction or, as I'm often accused of doing, which is writing creative non-fiction. But
which you don't do. Which I don't do, and I'm trying to inject aesthetics in it, but it is very, very factual and non-fiction. Yeah. But let the Buruma proposition stand, because it makes sense. Right. I have no quibble with it.
Well, can I quibble with it?
Because Buruma wants to criticize the Buruma proposition.
No, because I think it depends also on one's perspective and point of view. For example, if you were a Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war, and you were surrounded by the worst terror, and you'd write a poem about trees, it would in a sense be subversive, because it would mean a sort of a sign of life, and an entirely respectable thing to do. If you were a Nazi and you did the same thing, it would be an evasion, a deliberate evasion of reality, and henceforth you could criticize that. So I think I have to qualify my statement by saying it depends very much on where you stand.
Although, of course, Brecht was a communist and did evade.
Tim, there's just one phrase that I want to add from Latin America, which brings all the positions. I'm sure nobody will disagree with this. Ernesto Cardenal, the great Nicaraguan poet, said the constitutions of tomorrow will be constructed from the words of the love poems of today.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah. Could I just add one other possible refinement of this argument, which is that there's a difference between the judgment of today and the judgment of posterity. So in the judgment of the 1970s and 1980s, the great Czech writers, who everyone wanted to publish and laud, were Milan Kundera from outside, because he was criticizing the regime from outside, and Václav Havel from inside. And then somewhere in the background, there was this guy, Bohumil Hrabal, who wasn't exactly a collaborator, but he certainly wasn't an outspoken dissident. He just went on doing his thing. But I have to say, quite frankly, I think, in my judgment, and I guess the judgment of posterity, he was the best novelist, and time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent.
And very similar in style to Moyen.
Yeah. On that note, let the people speak. Who would like to ask a question? If you could, please wait for the microphone. There's a lady in the middle here, about 5 rows back. Yes, keep your hand up there. In spectacles, yes. If you could kindly identify yourself and stand up, perhaps, so we can see you. Thank you. And if you could tell us who the question is to.
Well, actually, my question...
No, it's the lady in front first, and then the lady behind.
Is that me, the lady in front?
You're the lady in front.
All right. I'm not quite sure who the question is addressed to, but we have been talking about people like Boyan and others. I also wanted to ask you what you thought of people like the person who wrote The General of the Dead Army, which was an Albanian writer who was brought out from Albania by a very courageous French publisher called Claude Durand, and who later...
Ismail Kadar.
Ismail Kadar, exactly, thank you. I had a little Alzheimer's hole in my head at that moment. So these are issues because he was also very heavily criticized by the Writers Association, by others who said he was hand in glove with the government. And I would like, your reflections on that. I mean, what does a writer do in extreme situations like that when Enver Hoxha ruled over Albania with an absolute iron hand?
Who would like to take Ismail Kadar? Ian.
No, you're the Eastern European.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ismail Kadar's problem is that he was neither a great dissident nor a great writer, but extremely keen on winning the Nobel Prize. And I think that is perhaps not the best combination. The lady 3 rows back.
All right. Yes, actually, my question is for the whole panel, whoever wished to say something. I'm in this situation that I carry a Swedish passport, I live in England, and I'm now working in Oman. And so I've been thinking a lot about the question of identity, and it also brings that to mind listening to the panelists, who some of you have direct experience of coming from elsewhere and living in a different context. And I would like anybody who would like to put some comments about, how it affects your sense of identity when you're addressing these kind of issues that you're writing about, or maybe either in fiction or non-fiction.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take that on?
I'd like to say something, but I think you should say something too. But I just wanted to say that exile is a very, very good place to be, to write. But it's a very painful place from which to write at the same time. Especially if you feel and you think that you want to go home, and then you discover that there is no such thing. It's disappeared, and you have to recreate it over and over again. And one of the things that you're an expert in is the nation state. And we haven't even mentioned the state. The problem is the nation state, and therefore, what happens when your state is incomplete? And is the language, after all, which will complete that state in some ways. You feel yourself inside and outside of that, and I think that's a very good place to be. But it's not something I would recommend to people who are faint of heart.
I mean, if one could just add a footnote to that, it seems to me an obvious proposition that there has to be at least some grain of alienation in any writer. Someone who feels totally comfortable in one country in their skin. Even Jane Austen had a little alienation somewhere, I think. Sudeep, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just to add to that, well, in India we have I can only speak for my country and frankly for myself. Here you talk about the visa issue. I think many writers over here are consumed with not the visa issue, but of the exit issue. Sometimes we feel that we may not be let out because of various reasons. One. The second thing is that it's also possible to feel like an alien in your own land as you continue to write and discuss and commentate living here. And it's quite schizophrenic because I can speak for myself. I feel like I belong and I'm an alien because of the positions I'm often forced to take and I choose to take. And the reaction that writers in India often, writers in India often face, filmmakers in India often face, painters. I'm talking about the entire creative arena here. And we have a strange situation where we belong, we are alienated, we are from the inside looking out, we're from the outside looking in. It's this great mishmash of exhilaration, confusion, trauma, all sorts of things which can actually exist in the same universe as we speak. So it's complex, it's complicated, and we have it over here.
Yeah. Selma, did you just want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just add on that. I mean, I have an incredibly schizophrenic identity, and I've moved a huge number of times, and I find like on the Palestinian issue, you have people who, when you're within Palestinian circles, they'll look at you as being, the person who won't be part of it because you're out, and when you go to somewhere else in the West, it's suddenly like there's an expectation that you know everything, you understand everything about this situation, and you're very Palestinian, and you're sort of and I feel that with writers, you're often, there are so few people in what's called what Ahdaf Swaif's called like the Metzatera between East and West who can understand both worlds, that there's often an over-expectation that fiction writers are able to comment on all kinds of aspects of a country and neighboring countries and on a level which is perhaps not the skills that they're set up to. So then you get the possibility that judgments are made more keenly about their politics than if they were coming from, they're not given the freedom to be apolitical.
Would you like to be liberated from the duty of being the conscience of the nation, so you could just be a writer?
Not entirely, no.
Not entirely.
No.
You might lose a subject or two.
You'd lose a subject or two. I mean, I think it's this question of, it's constantly fluctuating, and I think, like Ariel was saying, sometimes these decisions change as you go through your life. But I feel that it's like I'm a person first, and then I'm a writer, and part of my identity is Palestinian. But when something horrific happens and you feel extremely passionately about it, it all switches. You feel like, and the expectation on you changes. So it's like you're a Palestinian, therefore what can you do? You can write. And then it inverts.
Interesting.
What happens is that Jim, what happens is you've got to write from the tension.
Yeah.
There's not a situation like that. There's a constant tension that you're in. And so you've got to write from the complication of it and not lie about the complication of it. If you do that, then you'll be all right. It's when you start to lie about, it's fine, we're doing this fine. I didn't feel good about not writing the truth. I felt bad about it. And from there, you can find the truth.
Yeah.
But if you begin to lie to yourself, then we're in real trouble. I think that's where it really comes from. But you've got to accept that tension.
Could I take a question from the left somewhere, unless someone has a microphone? Is there, yes, here in the fourth row on the left, the lady in the fourth row on the left. And I'd be happy to take a question from the back. I suggest we collect a last few round of questions and then take them together.
Hi. I think in the beginning we were talking about how, I think Frank sir mentioned how some of his contemporaries have been writing with doggone determination. I think that were his exact words. Since I've been fortunate enough to grow up in a time where we haven't witnessed any revolution in our country for a while at least, I was just wondering whether you as writers believe that it is better to write with that kind of determination, with the romantic, like for me it seems like a very romantic idea that you're sent to jail for the things that you're writing, for a belief that you believe in with such conviction that you would even go to jail for it. But wouldn't it be smarter to, manipulate your way, maybe compromise on certain things, but still get more information, because you're always going to have a larger information base when you're outside of jail than in it?
I think I'll put that question to Sudeep, but if you could hold that for a moment, we'll collect it.
Yeah, you saw me getting over. Which country do you live in? Just checking.
India.
Just checking. I'm with you. I mean, I can't be suggestive and say the next time I get on the road, do come with me and visit the places I do and see. It's not a revolution. I mean, revolution's a big word. I think point of view is a humbler expression kind of thing, what people feel, so on and so forth. I think there's a great series of rebellions and dissent and even mini revolutions that are happening all across India. Perhaps not your India, but the India of 800 million people who are supposed to live as this grand economist who graduated from Oxford, no offense, who suggested that people who live on 32 rupees a day ought to be doing fine, and those who live at less than 32 rupees a day are really poor. So we live in a country like that, so I don't know, I'm not sure where this seething resentment that I see, this sort of, which is born of also a very seething hope. I'm not sure we're talking about the same country here. Perhaps there is a lack of exposure. I'm not trying to talk down at you, I'm not trying to patronize you in any way, but may I urge you to sort of visit the other Indias, the other universes that coexist, right outside Digby Palace, outside this charming venue. Sorry, forgive me.
Thank you for, I think, a very powerful response. The lady in the middle there, hand up, if you keep your hand up near the television camera, at the very far end of the row, if we could get a microphone there. And is there someone else over here? Further back, we might have a man for a change. A man in the middle of the row there. So first there, that lady near the camera, and then this gentleman about 8 rows back in the middle. There, keep your hand up. Yes, you. That's right. Please.
Okay, I just would like to share one thing, since I'm from Poland, and my country was in the past through very complicated historical situations, and very, very often we are not free to speak about many things. So basically when it comes to the literature, the tool that many artists were using was a metaphor, and even when we speak about Warsaw Ghetto, actually the situations that were described were very, very simple, very basic, but it could get to the people, it could catch the people's mind only because it was using by the metaphor. So even if we're not a free country, we still could touch people's heart using the very simple situation, many metaphors, and at the same time, people who were against this truth, people who didn't want to listen to the truth, they didn't understand the truth. So I think metaphor is a very, very strong tool that even in the countries when you are not really free to speak, you can still use it to talk about the truth. And I don't know if in your countries, in your situations as a writers, you use the metaphor to speak about what you want to say. And I just believe it's very, very useful when it comes to talking to people and sharing your own truth. Even if there's different perspectives about it, you can still catch the kind of the link, a common.
Dziękuję bardzo. It's very nice to see a Polish speaker here in Jaipur. Who would like to take that one? As I take it, the question is the so-called Aesopian school, which might be seen as somewhat ambivalent, using metaphor to try and convey messages, like Zbigniew Herbert writing about ancient Greece, or Ryszard Kapuscinski writing about Africa, but in fact writing about Poland. Ian.
Well, I mean, you could say that a slightly analogous way, or a different way to put your question is one that's often said, which is that somehow it's helpful to live in a slightly oppressive society because it forces artists to come up with better art than they would in a freer environment. I don't really buy that. I think it's true that certain artists, through metaphor, writers, Mikhail Bulgakov would be one, have created great masterpieces under terrible circumstances because they were in many ways forced to use metaphor. But I think it's too high a price to pay.
Yeah, I mean, George Steiner talked about the muse of censorship, which is one of the silliest things, I think, a critic has said in a long time. And you remember Sartre, when he went to Prague in the early 1960s, said, "How lucky you are to be oppressed. If only they'd throw us in prison in Paris, then we too could be even greater heroes in our nations." I think that's...
Pity the country that needs heroes.
Exactly so. Last question, the gentleman in the middle. If you keep your hand up, sir. Yes, that's you. Yeah.
Hello. I was actually interested in the Buruma proposition. So my question is to both Ariel and Ian. Where do you place a writer like Roberto Bolaño in this proposition? Because here was a writer who apparently lied about being imprisoned under Pinochet's regime, and yet his books constantly, celebrate and glamorize the act of being a poet. And one of his books is a series of imaginary biographies of these imaginary Nazi writers. It's called Nazi Literature in the Americas. And writers do all sorts of fascist things there under a fascist state. So what do you say about a writer like that?
Ian, first, maybe, and then Ariel.
I like Roberto Bolaño's fiction enormously, and how he invented or reinvented his life in order to play with the idea that he had fled Chile and had not been imprisoned. Because after all, this is a badge of honor. You've been beaten up. Wow, that's great. You feel really, really good about it, because as long as they don't kill you or kill the people around you. Basically, you have to understand that the real problem with politics and fiction isn't that you can't be politically fiction. I mean, you can't work with politics and fiction. You can work perfectly well. There are enormously wonderful books, like Bulgakov himself, right? I mean, is an example of that. The real problem is that when you decide what the truth is ahead of time, and there you impose it upon your characters, upon your language, that metaphor, you say, I'm going to do this with my fiction. Generally, the result is not very good literature, because you're trying to find out what the truth is. If you knew what the truth was, you wouldn't write. You're on a quest in that sense, and you don't know what the answer is. And it's that tension, it's that difficulty which makes your fiction or your non-fiction interesting. You don't know it at the end, right? So in the case of Bolaño, what's really interesting is that he really didn't know, and he was inventing and reinventing reality over and over again, right? Because nobody was speaking about fascism, he invented all these Nazi writers. And he's very critical. At the same time, he's very postmodernist. He's very sort of unable to take a stand where everything is relative to everything else. It's very legitimate. I mean, you can, again, posterity will say who was right and who was wrong. But generally, the worst writers are the ones who have the answers before they start writing.
Yeah, that does seem a bad idea for people in general, and not just writers, perhaps. If I could just add one comment to that, I also think if you are going to make it up, it's very important that the word fiction appears on the cover of your book, because there is, as we all know, a growing genre of so-called creative non-fiction where these boundaries are blurred. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to wrap it up there. I hope you'll agree we've had a really fascinating, stimulating discussion, and I'd like all the panelists.
Thank you all so much for a truly wonderful panel. Really, thank you all. It's a pleasure to have you. We have a small gift for each of you in the form of a scarf. So I'd also like to take the chance to thank Vodafone for presenting this session. Thanks to them, and we'll be back here again in about 10 minutes with the next session, which is God as a Political Philosopher, Dalit Perspectives on Buddhism, with Ajay Navaria, Kancha Ilaya, and Nirupama Dutt in conversation with Patrick French.